came to the wedding, but my daughter said, "Dad, I'm sorry, but you weren't invited, go away." I quietly left. 2 hours later, all payments for the wedding were cancelled. No me, no wedding. The silk of the tie was cool and smooth beneath Alan's fingers, a whisper of luxury he still wasn't entirely used to, even after all these years. He cinched the knot, a perfect silver dimple forming just below his Adam's apple. In the reflection of the hotel room's gilded mirror, a man he barely recognized stared back. The tailored charcoal suit fit him like a second skin, a far cry from the worn denim and sawdust-covered boots that had been his uniform for the first 2 decades of his career. On the dresser, nestled in a velvet box, was the Rolex he'd bought himself when his construction company landed its first $1 million contract. He fastened it around his wrist, the familiar weight a small, solid comfort. Today was not about him, though. It was about Chloe. His daughter. His brilliant, beautiful, and now married daughter. A lump formed in his throat, a complex knot of pride, love, and a sorrow so deep it felt like a part of his own architecture. He picked up the small, exquisitely wrapped gift from the bedside table. It wasn't extravagant, not compared to the wedding he had financed. He had spared no expense there. The historic manor with its sprawling gardens, the chef flown in from New York, the 10-piece band. He'd signed every check without a second thought, his only requirement that Chloe have the fairy tale day she'd always dreamed of. No, this gift was different. Inside the polished mahogany box was a small silver locket. He opened it. On one side was a photo of him swinging a 5-year-old Chloe in the park, her face a blur of laughter. On the other, a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. It was the first contract she had ever written him in crayon, promising to love Daddy forever in exchange for a puppy. A sad smile touched his lips. He remembered her coming to him a few months ago, her eyes bright with excitement about the wedding plans. "Dad, it's going to be perfect," she'd said, showing him brochures for venues that cost more than his first house. "Ben's parents are so wonderful, and we just want everything to be elegant." He'd heard the slight hesitation in her voice, the unspoken message. Elegant was code. It was a word that belonged to her mother's world, a world of old money and subtle condescension. A world that Alan, with his calloused hands and a fortune built from sweat and grit, had never truly been a part of. But he'd brushed it aside. For Chloe, he would build a bridge to any world she wanted to live in. The drive to the manor was a blur of impossibly green countryside and ancient stone walls. As he pulled his polished sedan up the long gravel driveway, the sheer scale of the place hit him. It was less a house and more a palace, a monument to the kind of wealth that was inherited, not earned. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried to open his door. He felt a familiar pang of unease, the sense of being an imposter. He straightened his suit jacket, the weight of the locket in his pocket a grounding force, and walked towards the soaring entrance. The sound of string music and champagne-fueled chatter washed over him as he stepped inside. The foyer was a cavern of marble and flowers, lilies and roses climbing towards a crystal chandelier that dripped light like frozen rain. He scanned the crowd of smiling, beautifully dressed strangers, searching for a familiar face. He found one and his heart sank. Diane. His ex-wife stood near the guest book, looking regal in an emerald green dress, a thin, predatory smile on her face as she spoke to an older couple. She saw him, and for a fleeting moment the smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something cold and sharp. Then the mask was back in place. She excused herself and glided towards him. "Alan," she said, her voice as smooth and hard as the marble floor. "I'm surprised to see you." "Diane," he replied, keeping his own voice even. "It's our daughter's wedding. Where else would I be?" Her laugh was a brittle thing. "Of course. Chloe will be so pleased." The word hung in the air, laced with poison. "The ceremony was lovely. You just missed it." A cold fist closed around Alan's gut. "It started at 3. It's 2:45. We decided to move it up a bit. The lighting was better for the photographs," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if changing the time of one of the most important moments of her daughter's life was as trivial as rearranging furniture. She turned away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone in the grand entrance, the locket in his pocket suddenly feeling heavy as lead. He tried to shake it off. Diane was being Diane. Chloe was what mattered. He moved further into the reception hall, the sheer opulence of it all staggering. A tower of champagne glasses glinted, waiters weaved through the crowd with silver trays, and on a far stage the band was warming up. He saw the seating chart on a large ornate easel and walked over looking for his name. Alan Reed. He scanned the list, table by table. Nothing. He checked again, his finger tracing the elegant calligraphy. The groom's family, the bride's friends, Diane's entire social circle, they were all there. But he wasn't. A young man in a tuxedo, the wedding planner's assistant, noticed his confusion. "Can I help you find your seat, sir?" "Yes, Alan Reed. I can't seem to find my name." The young man's smile was polite but strained. He consulted his tablet, his brow furrowing. "Reed. I'm sorry, sir, I don't have that name on my guest list." "There must be a mistake," Alan said, the blood starting to pound in his ears. "I'm the bride's father." The assistant's professional veneer cracked. A flash of pity crossed his face. I was told the bride's father wasn't attending." The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull roar. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, felt the whispers beginning to curl through the air like smoke. He was a spectacle. A ghost at the feast he had paid for. He needed to see Chloe. He needed her to fix this, to clear up this horrible, humiliating mistake. He found her near the French doors that led out to the terrace, surrounded by her bridesmaids, a vision in white lace and silk. She was radiant, her smile dazzling. But when her eyes met his across the room, the smile faltered. The light in her eyes dimmed. She murmured something to her friends and began walking towards him, her movements stiff, unnatural. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She wouldn't meet his gaze, her eyes fixed on a point just over his shoulder. "Chloe, honey, what's going on?" His voice was rough with emotion. "They're saying I'm not on the guest list. There's no table for me. It's some kind of mistake, right?" She took a deep, shuddering breath, finally forcing herself to look at him. Her beautiful face was pale, her eyes filled with a miserable cocktail of guilt and resolve. Behind her, he could see Diane watching them, her expression one of pure, unadulterated triumph. "It's not a mistake, Dad." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. He could only stare at her, at the daughter he had held in his arms, the daughter whose every dream he had worked to make a reality. What are you talking about?" He stammered. "Ben's parents and Mom, we all thought it would be better this way," she said, her voice trembling but gaining a cruel firmness. "It's just, you don't really fit in with them, Dad. It would be awkward." Awkward. The word twisted in his gut like a knife. He looked from her perfect dress to his own expensive suit, to the palace she stood in, and he understood. This was all his. He had paid for every petal, every candle, every note of music. And he was being told he didn't fit in. "I paid for all of this, Chloe," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I know, and we're so grateful," she said quickly, as if that was the end of it. Then came the final, killing blow. She took another step back, creating a chasm between them. "Dad, I'm sorry, but you weren't invited. Please, just go away. You're making a scene." Time stopped. The murmur of the crowd fell silent in his ears. The only thing he could see was his daughter's face, her features twisted into an expression of strained apology, asking him to disappear from the perfect picture he had funded. He looked past her to Diane, who gave a tiny, victorious nod. It was all so clear now. This was the final move in Diane's long, bitter chess game, and she had used their daughter as the queen to deliver checkmate. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. A strange, terrifying calm settled over him. The hurt was so immense, so absolute, that it circled back around to nothingness. He was numb. Without another word, he turned his back on his daughter. He walked steadily through the crowd of stunned faces, past the seating chart that bore no record of his existence, and out of the grand foyer. He didn't look back. The cold air hit his face as he stepped outside, and he walked past the waiting valets, not to his car, but down the long gravel drive, the crunch of the stones under his expensive shoes the only sound in his new, silent world. The fairy tale manor stood behind him, a beautiful, hollow monument to a love that had just been declared worthless. The crunch of the gravel beneath his shoes was the only sound that followed Alan as he walked. He didn't know how long the driveway was, only that each step carried him further from the echoing laughter and the warm glow of the manor, and deeper into the encroaching twilight. The world seemed to have muted its colors. The vibrant greens of the manicured lawns looked gray, and the brilliant blue sky had faded to a bruised purple at the edges. He felt a profound disconnect, as if he were watching a film of a man walking away from a life that was no longer his. His body moved on autopilot, his hands balled into fists in the pockets of his tailored suit, his jaw set so tight it ached. He reached his car, a sleek, dark sedan that was itself a symbol of his success. He'd bought it because Chloe had said she loved the color. Now it felt like a cage. He slid into the driver's seat, the scent of expensive leather filling his nostrils, a scent he usually associated with pride and accomplishment. Tonight it smelled of failure. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, staring through the windshield at the perfectly sculpted horizon, his daughter's words playing on a cruel, unending loop in his mind. "You don't fit in. It would be awkward. Go away." The numbness was a fragile dam holding back a flood of unspeakable pain. He felt a tremor start in his hands and fought to control it. He had built skyscrapers from dirt and blueprints, had faced down union bosses and hostile city councils, had weathered recessions that had broken lesser men. He had never in his 54 years felt so utterly powerless. He had been dismissed. Erased. Not by a business rival but by his own flesh and blood, the one person he believed was his unconditional legacy. His gaze fell to the passenger seat. The small mahogany gift box sat there, a silent, damning testament to his love. The locket. The crayon contract. The promise to love Daddy forever. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged gasp that was half sob, half growl. The dam broke. But it was not a flood of tears that came rushing through. It was something else entirely. Something cold, hard, and utterly clarifying. It was rage. It wasn't the hot, blinding fury of a bar fight. It was the focused, calculated anger of a demolition expert finding the precise load-bearing walls of a structure he intended to bring down. The pain was still there, a white-hot core deep within him, but now it had a purpose. It was fuel. His daughter and her mother had taught him a lesson about his place in their world. Now he would teach them a lesson about the world he commanded, the one where contracts are honored and bills are paid. His hands were steady now. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the leather-bound folio where he kept the paperwork for the wedding. Every contract, every vendor, every contact number was neatly organized. He'd always been meticulous. He started the car, the engine a low, menacing purr, and pulled out of the long driveway, turning onto the empty country road. He drove for 5 miles, then 10, until the last glow of the manor was gone from his rearview mirror. He found a small gravel turnout overlooking a quiet, darkening valley and put the car in park. The first call was the hardest. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name, Juliette Dubois, venue manager. He remembered her effusive praise for his generosity, her promises that Mr. Reed's daughter would have the wedding of the century. He pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice bubbly and professional. "Juliette Dubois speaking." "Juliette, this is Alan Reed." His voice was calm, level, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he used in boardrooms to kill bad deals. "Mr. Reed, I hope you are enjoying the festivities. Everything is simply divine, is it not?" "I'm not on the premises, Juliette," he said, the words as cold and sharp as chips of ice. "I'm calling to inform you that, per Section 7B of our agreement regarding host presence and facilitation, the contract has been breached. I am invoking the termination clause, effective immediately." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I don't understand, Mr. Reed." "A breach? The bride is here, the guests." "The host of the event, the signatory on the contract, myself, was denied entry and asked to leave the premises. Therefore, all services you are currently providing are no longer authorized by the paying party. Cease all operations. You have 15 minutes to inform the guests that the event is over, after which your staff is to begin clearing the property. My security deposit will cover the cost of the ceremony itself. Any further charges will be considered fraudulent." "But Mr. Reed, the reception has just started. The dinner, the band, we can't just—" "You can and you will," Alan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Or you will be hearing from my attorneys by dawn. Is that clear?" He could hear the frantic shuffling of papers, the panic in her short breaths. "Yes, Mr. Reed," she finally whispered, the professional lilt in her voice replaced by a tremor of fear. Crystal clear. He hung up without another word. One cord severed. He took a deep breath, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire in his chest. Next on the list, the caterer. He dialed. Antoine, he said when the famously temperamental chef answered. Alan Reed. Stop serving. The event is cancelled. Cancelled. The chef sputtered in his thick French accent. Monsieur, the sea base is plated. The truffle risotto is no longer my concern, Alan cut in. The venue's contract has been terminated. Yours is subsidiary to theirs. Pack up your food and your staff and send me a final bill for services rendered up to this point. He hung up before the man could launch into the string of French curses he could hear bubbling up. He moved down the list with a brutal efficiency. The photographer, a young, trendy artist who charged $20,000. Services for the reception are cancelled. Your contract is complete. The florist. No, you will not be paid for the reception centerpieces. They were part of a package deal that has been voided. The 10-piece band who were likely just taking the stage. He called their agent. Your band needs to stop playing and pack up their instruments. Yes, I'm aware of the 4-hour minimum. I'll pay it. But their presence is no longer required. He was happy to pay them, it wasn't their fault. He was severing the cords to the wedding, not punishing the innocent workers caught in the crossfire. With each call he felt a piece of the crushing weight lift from his shoulders. He was taking back control. They had tried to make him small, to make him invisible. But his power wasn't in his physical presence at their party. It was in the numbers in his bank accounts, the signature on his checks, the sheer force of will that had built an empire from nothing. He had built this fairy tale for his daughter, and he would be the one to tear it down. The final call was to the concierge at his credit card company, the exclusive black card he used for major expenses. He explained the situation calmly and rationally, not as a heartbroken father, but as a client whose agreements had been flagrantly violated. I want a stop payment placed on all pending charges related to the vendors I'm about to list for you. I will be disputing them as services not rendered according to the terms of the signed contracts. As he read out the names of the vendors, the venue, the caterer, the wedding planner who had so conveniently forgotten to include his name on the guest list, he felt the last of the connections to that life crumble into dust. The transaction was complete. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The mahogany box sat beside it, gleaming in the faint light from the dashboard. He stared at it for a long time. He pictured the smiling 5-year-old inside the locket, the little girl who had promised to love him forever. A single, hot tear finally escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. It was a tear for the girl he had lost, not for the woman who had sent him away. He picked up the box, opened the glove compartment, and placed it gently inside, next to the car's owner's manual. He closed the door, the soft click echoing in the profound silence of the car. The past was now locked away. He put the car in gear and pulled back onto the dark, empty road. He didn't drive back towards the city, towards his large, empty home. He turned the other way, heading west towards the mountains with no destination in mind. He just drove, the white lines of the road hypnotic in his headlights, leaving the smoking ruin of his daughter's perfect day behind him. For a glorious hour, Chloe felt like the queen of a world she had only ever read about in magazines. The guilt that had pricked at her conscience when she'd watched her father's solitary figure walk away had been a small, manageable thing, easily smoothed over by her mother's soothing words and a glass of chilled champagne. "You did the right thing, darling," Diane had murmured, dabbing at a non-existent tear with the corner of a silk handkerchief. "He would have made a scene. You know how he gets. This is far more elegant." And it was elegant. It was breathtaking. The great hall of the manor was a symphony of cream and gold, bathed in the soft, romantic glow of 1,000 candles. The scent of lilies and orchids hung heavy in the air, mingling with the expensive perfumes of their guests. The string quartet had given way to a lively jazz band, and the sound of laughter and conversation was a warm, constant buzz. Chloe moved through the crowd on her new husband's arm, her smile feeling as natural and bright as the diamonds at her throat. Ben's parents, the formidable Charles and Eleanor Vance, had even seemed impressed. "A truly spectacular affair, Chloe," Eleanor had said, her eyes sweeping the room with an appraising glint. "You have exceptional taste." The compliment had landed like a coronation. This was it. This was the life she had been striving for, the acceptance she craved. She was no longer just Chloe Reed, the daughter of a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing. She was Mrs. Benjamin Vance, a seamless part of a world where grace and influence were the only currencies that mattered. Her father's world was one of concrete and steel, of loud machinery and sweat-stained contracts. This world was one of crystal and silk, of quiet agreements and inherited legacies. She had made her choice. She was laughing at something one of Ben's groomsmen said when it happened. The band was in the middle of a jaunty, upbeat rendition of a Sinatra classic when, without warning, the sound cut out. The final saxophone note was sliced clean in half, leaving behind a silence so sudden and so absolute that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. For a moment, nobody moved. 100 conversations died in 100 throats. Heads turned towards the stage, expecting an announcement or perhaps a clumsy transition to the next song. On stage, the band members looked just as confused, exchanging shrugs and tapping their microphones. Then the lead singer spoke into the dead mic, his voice unnaturally loud in the silent hall. Folks, looks like we're having some technical difficulties. We'll be right back." Diane materialized at Chloe's elbow, her face a mask of irritation. "For heaven's sake," she hissed, her eyes scanning for the wedding planner. "Amateurs. Find that girl and tell her to fix this now." But before anyone could move, a new, more ominous sound filled the hall, the quiet, determined squeak of rubber-soled shoes moving with purpose across the polished marble floor. It was Juliette Dubois, the venue manager, and she was not smiling. Her face was pale and tight, her usual professional warmth replaced by a brittle, anxious energy. She clutched a tablet to her chest like a shield. She made a beeline not for the stage but for them. "Mrs. Vance, Ms. Reed," Juliette began, her voice low and strained. She avoided calling Diane by her married name, a subtle but clear signal that this was official business. "May I have a word with you in private?" "There's nothing private about a power failure," Diane snapped. "Just get the music back on." "It's not a power failure," Juliette said, her gaze flickering nervously towards the assembled guests, who were now watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. "Please. Over here." She led them to a small alcove near the entrance, the silence of the party following them like a searchlight. Ben and his father, Charles, trailed behind, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern. "What is the meaning of this, Ms. Dubois?" Charles Vance demanded, his voice accustomed to immediate and satisfactory answers. Juliette took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on Chloe. "A few moments ago, I received a phone call from the event's legal and financial host, Mr. Alan Reed." Chloe's heart stopped. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, flooded her veins, chasing away the warm champagne buzz. She felt the blood drain from her face. "He informed me," Juliette continued, her voice now flat and robotic, as if reading from a script, "that the terms of the venue contract were breached when he, the host, was denied entry to the event. He has invoked the termination clause. All services from the manor are to cease immediately." Diane let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "That's absurd. He can't do that. I'll write you a check for the full amount myself right now. This is my daughter's wedding." "I'm afraid you can't, Ms. Reed," Juliette said, her professionalism a cold, impenetrable wall. "Our contract, a legally binding document, is with Mr. Reed and Mr. Reed alone. His instructions were explicit. The event is over. You have—" She glanced at her watch. "5 minutes to inform your guests. My staff has been instructed to begin clearing the hall at that time." "You can't be serious," Ben exclaimed, stepping forward. "You're kicking us out." As if on cue, a new wave of motion rippled through the grand hall. From the service doors, a small army of waiters and kitchen staff emerged. But they weren't carrying trays of food. They moved from table to table, and with quiet, apologetic murmurs, began clearing everything away. Full glasses of wine, untouched plates of sea bass, the bread baskets, the water goblets. The celebrated chef, Antoine, stood grim-faced by the kitchen doors, directing his staff with curt, angry gestures. Then 2 of his sous chefs appeared, wheeling out the magnificent 5-tiered wedding cake. They weren't taking it to be cut, they were taking it back to the kitchen. A wave of gasps and outraged whispers erupted from the guests. The illusion was not just broken, it was being systematically dismantled before their very eyes. What is happening? Eleanor Vance's voice was a horrified whisper beside Chloe. Charles, make them stop this. But Charles Vance was staring at Diane, his eyes narrowed with dawning comprehension and fury. Diane, he said, his voice dangerously low. What did you do? Chloe couldn't breathe. Her world was tilting on its axis. She fumbled in her small, beaded purse for her phone, her hands trembling so violently she could barely unlock it. She found her father's contact. Dad. She pressed the call button, praying he would pick up, that she could cry and apologize and beg him to fix this nightmare. The call went straight to voicemail. Hi, you've reached Alan Reed. I'm unavailable right now. Please leave a message. The cheerful, familiar voice was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. He wasn't just angry. He had disappeared. He had erased them. Suddenly, the soft, romantic lighting of the great hall was extinguished, replaced by the harsh, flat, unforgiving glare of the overhead fluorescent utility lights. The golden room was instantly transformed into a stark, sterile ballroom, exposing every flaw: the slightly wilted flower, the wine stain on a tablecloth, the shocked and ugly expressions on the faces of her guests. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her magnificent white gown feeling like a fool's costume. The fairy tale was over. The stage had been stripped bare, the magic gone, revealing the cold, hard reality underneath. She had made a deal to get into this perfect world, and the price had been her father. Now the bill had come due, and she was utterly, hopelessly bankrupt. The harsh, fluorescent light stripped all the magic from the room, leaving only a brutal, ugly reality. Chloe stood in her perfect dress, a snow-white island in a sea of chaos and recrimination. The remaining guests were no longer celebrating. They were evacuating, their faces a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled disgust. They moved in a hushed, hurried stream towards the exit, casting backward glances at her, the disgraced bride at the center of the most spectacular wedding collapse any of them had ever witnessed. The whispers followed them out the door, sharp and stinging as shards of glass. Can you imagine the humiliation? Always said his money was new. Her father, of all people. The venue staff moved with the cold efficiency of a cleanup crew after a disaster, clearing tables, stacking chairs, and rolling up magnificent floral carpets that had been laid only hours before. Every sound, the clatter of silverware being thrown into bins, the squeak of a trolley's wheels, was an accusation. But the murmurs of the departing guests were nothing compared to the storm that had erupted in the small alcove. A fiasco, Charles Vance declared, his voice a low, controlled rumble that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. He wasn't looking at Chloe but at his son Ben. You have attached the Vance name to a public spectacle of monumental proportions. It wasn't my fault, Ben said, his face pale and blotchy. He shot a helpless, pleading look at Chloe. I didn't know this was going to happen. You should have, his mother Eleanor cut in, her voice thin and sharp as a stiletto. She finally turned her glacial gaze on Chloe, and there was no trace of the warmth from earlier. We trusted your judgment, Chloe. We believed you understood the importance of decorum, of stability. We thought you were different from the chaos of your background. The unspoken words hung in the air. We thought the money had scrubbed the working class grit off you, but we were wrong. The insult was so profound, so dismissive, it momentarily stunned Chloe into silence. This was the family she had contorted herself to please, the acceptance for which she had sacrificed her own father. While the Vances dissected her with cold precision, her mother was imploding. Diane's face was a mottled mask of fury, her carefully constructed composure shattered. He will not get away with this, she shrieked, her voice echoing in the emptying hall. This is psychological terrorism. I will sue him for every penny he has. He is a vindictive, brutish monster. I told you he was, Chloe, didn't I always tell you? Her mother's tirade, which had once seemed like righteous anger, now sounded like the panicked screeching of a cornered animal. For the first time, Chloe saw the ugly truth beneath the surface. This wasn't about protecting her. It was about Diane's own failed war against Alan, a war in which Chloe had just been deployed as a catastrophically unsuccessful weapon. Stop it, Mom, Chloe whispered, the words barely audible. Just stop. Don't you dare take his side. Diane rounded on her. After what he's done to you. To your perfect day. What I've done, Chloe corrected, the horrifying weight of the truth finally settling in her bones. I did this. Ignoring her mother's sputtering rage, she turned and pushed her way through the grim procession of staff, her wedding dress catching on a stack of folded tablecloths. She needed air. She needed to escape the crossfire of glares and accusations. She burst through a side door and found herself in a small manicured garden, the night air cool on her flushed skin. Her hands trembling, she tried her father's number again. Straight to voicemail. She hung up and started texting, her thumbs flying across the screen with a clumsy, desperate speed. Dad, please pick up. There's been a huge mistake. No reply. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. Please call me. The little delivered notification beneath her message was a cold, indifferent tombstone. Mom made me do it. I never wanted to. Dad, please. It was a lie, a weak, childish attempt to shift the blame, and she knew it. The shame burned in her throat. Dad, I'm begging you. Please. Don't do this. The silence from his end was an answer more powerful than any angry words could ever be. He had built a wall around himself, and for the first time in her life she had no way to scale it. He had always been her safety net, the one person who would fix any problem, sign any check, absorb any mistake. Now the net was gone. She was in free fall. The walk of shame from the manor was the most humiliating experience of her life. There was no grand exit through a shower of confetti, no vintage car whisking them away. They were escorted out a service entrance by a stony-faced security guard, emerging into a parking lot filled with the last of the departing guests, who slowed their cars to stare. They piled into Charles Vance's Rolls-Royce in a thick, suffocating silence, Charles at the wheel, Eleanor beside him, and Chloe and Ben in the back, a foot of cold leather separating them. Chloe stared out the window, hot tears blurring the passing headlights into streaks of hazy light. Beside her, Ben didn't reach for her hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just sat there, rigid with his own humiliation, a stranger in a tuxedo. She had married a man who, at the first sign of trouble, had retreated to his parents' side, leaving her to face the fallout alone. The foundations of her brand-new marriage felt like they were made of sand. Their hotel suite, the one her father had paid for, was an opulent prison. Roses and champagne awaited them, a cruel mockery of the wedding night they were supposed to be having. Ben walked straight past it all and into the lavish marble bathroom, closing the door with a soft, final click. Chloe was left alone in the cavernous living room, the train of her ridiculously expensive dress pooled around her feet like a shroud. She sank onto a velvet sofa, the phone still clutched in her hand. She scrolled through the photos from earlier in the day, getting ready with her bridesmaids, the beautiful ceremony she'd rushed her father out of, the first kiss as husband and wife. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, a scene from someone else's life. The whole day, the whole relationship, her entire future, it all felt like an elaborate house of cards, built on a foundation of her father's money and her own weak-willed ambition. And with one quiet, decisive act, her father had pulled out the bottom card. Now, she was left sitting in the wreckage, realizing she never truly understood the man who held it all up. She hadn't just misjudged his feelings. She had catastrophically misunderstood his power. Alan drove until the manicured countryside of the wedding venue gave way to the familiar, gritty outskirts of the city he had helped build. He drove through the clean, quiet suburbs where his own house stood like a silent, empty museum, and kept going, heading downtown. He navigated the pre-dawn streets, the traffic lights blinking a lonely rhythm of yellow and red in the darkness, until he reached the industrial sector, a part of the city that didn't sleep so much as it paused. Here, the air smelled of diesel fumes and welding sparks, a scent he found more honest and comforting than any expensive perfume. He turned down a narrow, cobbled alley and killed the engine. In front of him was a simple two-story brick building with large, grimy windows. The faded sign above the roll-up door was barely legible, but he knew what it said: Reed & Son Construction. The & Son had been a hopeful fiction, a dream from a time when he'd imagined a boy to carry on the business. He'd never changed it, even after Chloe was born. The keys felt foreign in his hand after so many years, but the lock turned with a familiar, grating groan. He rolled up the heavy metal door, the sound echoing like thunder in the sleeping alley. He stepped inside, and it was like stepping back in time. The air was thick with the holy scent of his past: sawdust, mineral oil, and cold iron. Dust motes, thick as ghosts, danced in the single beam of a streetlight that pierced the gloom. He ran a hand along the surface of the main workbench, a massive slab of maple scarred with the history of 1,000 projects. He could still see the faint circular stain where a can of varnish had spilled 25 years ago. Over in the corner was the old table saw he'd bought with the profits from his very first job. This place was more a part of him than his own blood, it seemed. This place had never been ashamed of him. The rumpled, ridiculously expensive suit felt like a costume. He stripped off the jacket, draping it over a stack of old blueprints. He rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt and looked at his hands. They were soft now, the hands of a man who signed checks and shook hands on deals. But he remembered when they were rough and calloused, permanently stained with wood varnish and etched with the small nicks and scars of honest labor. He had traded those hands for a daughter who wouldn't be seen with him. The thought landed not with the fire of rage, but with the cold, heavy thud of grief. His phone began to buzz again, a frantic, insistent vibration against the silent workbench. He picked it up. 37 missed calls from Chloe. A string of texts, each one more desperate than the last. He read the last one she'd sent. "Dad, I'm begging you. Please. Don't do this." The plea was for the party, he knew. Not for him. She was begging him not to take away her toys. He stared at his daughter's name on the screen, and a profound weariness washed over him. He wasn't just a father, he was a function. A provider. A wallet. He had worked his entire life to give her a world without sharp edges, and in doing so, he had raised a woman who couldn't see the man who had sanded them down. Maybe this was his fault as much as it was hers and Diane's. He had built her a gilded cage and never taught her how to fly on her own. With a final, decisive movement, he pressed and held the power button. The screen went black. The buzzing stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was a relief. He needed to do something, to feel something real. He found an old block plane on a dusty shelf, its blade rusted at the edges. He spent the next hour methodically disassembling it, cleaning each piece with an oil-soaked rag, sharpening the blade on a whetstone until it had an edge that could shave the hair from his arm. The familiar, repetitive motions were a meditation. The smell of the honing oil, the scrape of steel on stone, it was a language his body understood, a comfort that no amount of money could buy. Just as the sun began to cast weak, gray light through the dirty windows, the sound of boots crunching on gravel made him look up. An older, heavy-set man in a flannel shirt and a worn baseball cap stood in the open doorway, holding 2 steaming styrofoam cups. "Knew it was you, Al," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "Saw the door was up. Figured your fancy coffee machine might be on the fritz." It was Frank Kowalski. His first ever employee, now a site foreman for a rival company. They hadn't spoken in a couple of years, but the bond between men who have framed houses together in the freezing rain runs deep. "Frank," Alan said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "What are you doing here?" "My guys are starting a job down the block. Thought I was seeing a ghost." Frank walked in, handing Alan a cup. The coffee was black, bitter, and scaldingly hot. It was the best thing Alan had tasted all day. "Been a while since you've been back to the old stomping grounds. What's the occasion? Finally get tired of counting your money?" Alan managed a small laugh, leaning against the workbench. "Something like that." Frank didn't press. He looked around the workshop, a fond, nostalgic look in his eyes. "God, I miss this place. Remember that Henderson job? When we had to hoist that steel I-beam by hand 'cause the crane broke down? My back still hurts thinking about it." "You complained for a week straight," Alan recalled. "But we got it done." "Damn right we did," Frank said, taking a sip of his coffee. He nodded towards the freshly sharpened block plane in Alan's hands. "Good to see you haven't forgotten how to use your hands. This place, this is where the real work got done. Built half the city out of this dusty old garage." The simple words landed with more force than any compliment from a fawning architect or a grateful client. The real work. Frank saw him not as the wealthy magnate but as Al, the man who knew how to build things that would last. His worth wasn't in a bank statement. It was in the foundations of the buildings they had raised, in the respect of a man like Frank. It was a bedrock that no one could take from him. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, 2 old soldiers surveying a familiar battlefield. Finally, Frank clapped him on the shoulder. Well, I gotta go yell at some kids who think a nail gun is a toy. You take care of yourself, Al. Don't be a stranger. As Frank walked away, Alan looked around the workshop with new eyes. It wasn't a relic of his past, it was his anchor. It was the proof of who he was. Chloe and Diane had tried to cast him out of their world, but they could never touch this one. This world was his. He had built it. He took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since he'd first read the wedding invitation. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was the first faint stirring of his own unshakable foundation settling back into place. The day after the wedding was not a day of blissful recovery but of tense, agonizing postmortem. The magnificent hotel suite, with its panoramic city views and a bed strewn with congratulatory rose petals, felt less like a lover's nest and more like a beautifully appointed war room where Chloe was on the losing side. Ben had not slept in the bed with her. He had emerged from the bathroom hours after the fiasco, his tuxedo replaced by a silk robe, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He'd spent the night on the long velvet sofa, a chasm of unspoken accusations separating them. Now, in the bright, unforgiving light of morning, he paced the floor, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't talking to his friends. He was talking to his father, and from the clipped, deferential tone of his responses, Chloe knew he was not receiving congratulations. He was receiving orders. When he finally hung up, he didn't look at her. He stared out the window at the sprawling city below, a city where, somewhere, her father was. "My parents have made their position clear," Ben said, his voice flat and detached. "They are appalled. The Vance name is synonymous with integrity and social grace. Last night was the antithesis of both." Chloe sat on the edge of the bed, the silk of her own robe feeling cold against her skin. "Ben, I am so sorry. I never imagined." "That's the problem, Chloe," he cut in, finally turning to face her. His eyes were not angry, but worse, they were disappointed, as if he were looking at a faulty investment. "You didn't imagine. You didn't think. My father wants to know one thing. Whose idea was it, specifically, to have your own father thrown out of your wedding?" Before Chloe could even form an answer, the door to the suite opened and Diane swept in, carrying a leather briefcase and an air of beleaguered defiance. She had traded her emerald gown for a severe Chanel suit, armor for the battle she intended to wage. "I've been on the phone with our lawyers since 6 a.m., she announced, ignoring Ben completely and setting her briefcase down with a sharp click. "We have a clear case for emotional distress, breach of contract on the part of the venue for caving to his illegal demands." "My father wants to know whose idea it was," Ben repeated, his voice colder now. Diane finally acknowledged him with a dismissive wave of her hand. "It was a mutual decision born of necessity. We were trying to prevent a scene and protect the integrity of the event. Charles, of all people, should understand the need to manage difficult family members. Alan's behavior was a calculated act of sabotage by a bitter, vulgar man. He is the one who should be answering for this, not us." She launched into the familiar, well-worn tirade, the same speech Chloe had been hearing in various forms since she was 10 years old. Alan was brutish. Alan was uncivilized. Alan had no appreciation for the finer things. He was a bull in a china shop, and she, Diane, had spent her life trying to clean up his messes. But something was different this time. Chloe listened to the venomous words, and for the first time, they didn't sound like a defense of elegance. They sounded like an obsession. The phrases were too practiced, the anger too polished. It was a script, one Diane had been performing for years, and Chloe suddenly felt like she was waking up from a long, deep trance. She thought of her father, not as the hulking, awkward presence her mother described, but as the man who had patiently taught her how to ride a bike, his big, rough hands holding the seat steady. She remembered him showing up to her ballet recitals, looking out of place in his work clothes, but with a proud smile that lit up his entire face. She remembered the camping trip her mother had refused to go on, calling it barbaric. Chloe had gone, and she'd had the time of her life, watching her father expertly build a fire and name the constellations in the night sky. Every memory was tinged with her mother's subtle disapproval, a quiet poisoning of the well. A gift he brought her from a business trip was a sweet, if tacky, gesture. His pride in his company was braggadocious. His desire to be involved in her life was overbearing. 4 years Chloe had absorbed these little drops of poison, never realizing they were turning her against the one person who had never asked for anything in return. And frankly, the Van Cess should be thanking me for trying to spare them the embarrassment of his presence. Diane was concluding, her voice ringing with self-righteous fury. "Stop it," Chloe said. The words were quiet, but they sliced through her mother's tirade like a razor. Diane and Ben both stared at her. "What did you say?" Diane asked, her eyes narrowing. "I said stop," Chloe repeated, standing up. Her voice was stronger now, trembling with a nascent, unfamiliar rage of her own. "Just stop blaming him. For 1 second, stop. I have every right to blame him. He destroyed your wedding." "No." Chloe's voice cracked. "He didn't. I did. And you helped me. We stood there in my wedding dress and we told him to go away. We told him he wasn't welcome at a party he paid for. What did you think was going to happen? That he would just meekly drive off and send a check for the rest? I thought he had some shred of decency left." "Decency?" Chloe let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You think it's decent to use your own daughter to humiliate her father? This was never about the Van Cess or elegance or making my day perfect. This was about you. This was just another battle in your endless war with Dad, and you used my wedding, my life, as your battlefield." The color drained from Diane's face, replaced by a blotchy, defensive red. "How dare you? After everything I have done for you, the sacrifices I have made to give you a life he never could have. The life he paid for." Chloe shot back, the words tearing out of her, raw and painful. "He paid for the schools, the cars, the clothes, this hotel suite. He paid for everything. All you did was teach me how to be ashamed of him. You didn't care if I had a father at my wedding. You just wanted to win. You wanted to finally prove you could erase him." The ugly truth of it hung in the air, undeniable and toxic. Diane's mouth opened and closed, but for once no words came out. The script had failed her. Ben just watched, his expression turning from disappointment to outright disgust. He was a spectator at the ugly unraveling of the family he had just married into. Then Diane's shock curdled into pure venom. "He deserved it," she hissed, her voice low and shaking with years of stored resentment. "After he left me, after he chose his filthy, dusty business over me, he deserved to be put in his place. And so do you, you ungrateful little—" She cut herself off, but it was too late. The mask was completely gone, and what lay beneath was terrifying. Chloe simply stared at her, the last vestiges of her childhood illusions shattering into dust. This was the woman who had shaped her. This was the voice she had trusted. Without another word, Diane snatched her briefcase from the table and stormed out of the suite, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed in the silent room. Chloe was left standing in the middle of the floor, shaking. Ben wouldn't meet her eyes. He picked up his phone, turned his back to her, and walked out onto the balcony, closing the glass door firmly behind him. She was utterly and completely alone. The poisoned well was empty, and she was finally dying of thirst. For 3 days Alan existed in the quiet, dusty sanctuary of his old workshop. He did not go home. He did not check his email. His phone remained off, a silent black rectangle on the scarred workbench. He spent his time with the simple, honest companionship of tools and wood. He repaired the warped frame on the old window, planed a piece of rough-hewn oak until it was as smooth as glass, and methodically organized decades of accumulated hardware into neatly labeled bins. It was grounding work, a way of bringing order to a small corner of the world when his own had been thrown into chaos. His isolation was finally broken by a sleek, black car that pulled into the alley, a type of vehicle that had no business being in this part of the city. A young man in a sharp suit got out and approached him cautiously. He was a junior lawyer from the firm that had handled Alan's divorce. He carried a briefcase full of letters and threats from Diane's legal team. Alan didn't read them. He simply looked at the young man and said, "Tell her I will meet with her. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. My office." The next morning, Alan was not in his workshop. He was showered, shaved, and dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, seated behind the massive mahogany desk in his corner office on the 40th floor of the Reed Tower. The building was the crown jewel of his company, a skyscraper of steel and smoked glass that dominated the city skyline. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he had a panoramic view of the world he had built street by street, foundation by foundation. The office was minimalist and immaculate. There were no family photos on his desk. Not anymore. When his assistant buzzed to announce Diane's arrival, he felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The rage had burned away, the grief had settled into a hard, dense core, and what was left was a quiet, unshakable resolve. He had spent his life reacting to Diane's emotional storms. Today he would be the weather. She swept in, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and barely contained fury. She was dressed for battle, her face a taut mask of indignation. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit. "I hope you're satisfied, Alan," she began, her voice dripping with scorn. "I hope ruining your daughter's life was worth whatever petty revenge you think you've exacted." Alan said nothing. He simply watched her, his hands resting calmly on the polished surface of his desk. His silence unnerved her. She had come expecting a fight, a shouting match where she could deploy her usual arsenal of guilt and accusation. His stillness gave her nothing to push against. "My lawyers are drawing up the papers," she continued, her voice rising. "The emotional damages alone are incalculable. You traumatized Chloe. You humiliated her in front of her new family, in front of everyone. You will pay for that." He let her talk, letting the threats and accusations fill the quiet office. He heard about the shame, the scandal, the trauma. He heard, once again, what a brute he was, how he had always been jealous of her and Chloe's more refined life. He let the poison she had been dripping into his life for 20 years spill onto the floor until she finally began to run out of steam, her tirade ending with a familiar, plaintive cry. "How could you do that to your own daughter?" She finished, a tremor of what she likely thought was convincing emotion in her voice. Only then did Alan move. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a thin, leather-bound document folder onto the desk. He pushed it slowly, deliberately, across the vast expanse of mahogany until it stopped directly in front of her. "What is this?" she asked, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "A settlement offer? It's not going to be enough." "Open it," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of command. She hesitated, then flipped open the cover. Inside was not a legal document but a neatly typed multi-page ledger. The first page was titled, "Educational Expenses, Chloe M. Reed." Below it was an itemized list starting with her enrollment fee for the city's most exclusive preschool, followed by 17 years of private tuition, tutors, school trips, and art supplies. At the bottom of the page was a staggering 6-figure total. She stared at it, confused. "What is the meaning of this?" "Turn the page," he said. The next page was titled Living Expenses. It detailed the down payment on her first apartment, the cost of her first car, her monthly allowance through college, insurance payments, and cell phone bills. The list went on and on. Page after page, the story of Chloe's life was told in neat columns of dates and dollar amounts. Vacations to Europe. A horse she'd wanted when she was 12. The designer wardrobe she'd needed to fit in at college. Finally, she reached the last page. At the top, in stark black letters, it read, "Wedding Expenses, Chloe M. Reed and Benjamin A. Vance." Every last detail was there. The venue's security deposit, the non-refundable fee for the dress, the payment for the ceremony musicians, the cost of the invitations. The final sum was obscene. And at the very bottom of the last page was the grand total, the sum of a lifetime of his provision. A number with a lot of zeros. Diane looked up from the papers, her face pale with a mixture of shock and dawning fury. "You're billing me? After all these years, you're sending your daughter a bill? You are insane." "That's not a bill, Diane," Alan said, his voice still unervingly calm. "It's a receipt. It's a record of the love and support you taught her to mistake for a cash withdrawal. You sat here and talked about emotional damages. That document is the final accounting of the only emotion you ever taught Chloe to associate with me, obligation." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze pinning her in place. "For 20 years you have enjoyed the lifestyle this company provided, all while teaching our daughter to be ashamed of the man and the work that paid for it. You taught her that I didn't fit in. You taught her my name was something to be managed, hidden, and ultimately erased. On Saturday you finally succeeded. You coached her, you manipulated her, and you erased me from her perfect day." He sat back, the finality in his voice as solid as the building's foundation. So this isn't about the wedding. It's about this. He tapped the folder. This is over. My role as the silent financier of your social ambitions is terminated. The bank is closed. Chloe is a married woman. She is your responsibility now. You and her are on your own. Diane stared at him, speechless. Her threats were useless. Her guilt trips had no purchase. He had taken her entire narrative and reduced it to a number on a page, and in doing so had robbed her of all her power. Her composure finally shattered. With a cry of pure, impotent rage, she swept the folder off the desk, sending the pages fluttering to the expensive carpet. You are a monster, Alan. A cold, heartless machine. No, Diane, he said, rising from his chair and walking to the window, turning his back on her for the last time. I'm a builder. I just demolished a structure that had a rotten foundation. We're done here. Please see yourself out. He heard a strangled sob of fury, the sound of her chair scraping back, and the furious click of her heels as she stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Alan stood alone, looking out at the city spread before him like a blueprint. He had won. He had severed the last toxic tie to his ex-wife. It was a victory, but it tasted like ashes. He had freed himself, but in drawing the final line on that ledger, he had also codified the vast, empty distance between himself and his daughter. The war with Diane was over, but he was left standing alone on the battlefield. Weeks bled into a month. The autumn air grew crisp, and the leaves on the trees outside Alan's workshop began their slow, brilliant surrender to the coming winter. The workshop had become his sanctuary, the place he returned to after long days at the office. The clean, sharp scent of sawdust was a balm to his soul, and the honest, physical work of creation was slowly mending the parts of him that felt broken. He was running a piece of dark walnut through the table saw, the blade's high-pitched whine filling the space, when a movement at the open bay door made him look up. He hit the kill switch, and the sudden silence that descended was heavy and absolute. Standing there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, was Chloe. She was a ghost of the woman he had last seen. The radiant, untouchable bride was gone. In her place was a young woman who looked tired and achingly fragile. She wore simple jeans and a plain gray sweater, her hair was pulled back without any particular style, and her face was pale and devoid of makeup. She looked, for the first time since she was a teenager, like his daughter, not a carefully curated piece of art. She clutched the strap of a worn-looking handbag like a lifeline. Alan felt a complex, painful lurch in his chest. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply stood by the silent saw and waited. It was her move. She had come to his territory. Chloe took a hesitant step into the workshop, her eyes wide as she took in the space. It was the first time she had ever been there. She looked at the old tools, the stacks of lumber, the intricate blueprints pinned to a corkboard. She was a tourist in the land that had built her life. "Dad," she said, her voice small and rough, as if it hadn't been used much lately. He just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and continued to wait. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back, taking a shaky breath. The marriage was annulled," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Ben's parents paid for it all. They said it was the cleanest way to mitigate the public relations damage. Ben didn't even argue. I haven't seen him since that week." Alan remained silent. This wasn't news he cared about. It was a consequence, not a cause. "I tried to talk to Mom," Chloe continued, her voice cracking. She's suing the Van Cess now. Something about emotional manipulation. She wanted me to sign an affidavit. I wouldn't. She hasn't spoken to me since. She was an island now, he realized. The two powerful forces that had shaped her life, her mother's toxic ambition and the Van Cess cold social currency, had both abandoned her when she was no longer of use. Finally, she took another step closer, her eyes locking with his. The professional recitation of facts was over. "That's not why I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not here for money. I'm not here for you to fix anything." She stopped a few feet from him, and the tears she'd been holding back began to fall, silent tracks on her pale cheeks. "I'm here to apologize. No excuses. Not because of Mom, not because of Ben. Because of me." Her breath hitched on a sob. All my life you gave me everything. And I repaid you by being ashamed. I let Mom teach me that your work was something to hide, that your love was just a bank account. And I was so stupid, so weak and empty that I believed her. I believed that a fancy party was more important than my own father. She looked down at her hands, then back at him, her eyes filled with a raw, desperate shame that he knew was genuine. The worst part, Dad, the worst part is that when I stood there and told you to go away, I knew it was wrong. I felt it, right here, she pressed a hand to her chest. But I did it anyway. Because I was a coward. What I did to you was cruel and it was unforgivable, and I am so sorry. Not for the wedding or the money. I'm sorry for not seeing you. For throwing you away. She finished, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. She had said the words. Now there was nothing left but to see where they landed. Alan finally moved. He picked up a soft rag and began to wipe the fine layer of sawdust from his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. He could see the years of his own mistakes in her tear-stained face, the spoiling, the enabling, the failure to teach her that character is worth more than comfort. I heard you, Chloe, he said, his voice level and gravelly. But sorry is a word. I don't know what it means yet. It's easy to be sorry when you have nothing left. The words were hard but not cruel. They were the truth. He looked past her towards the open door. Do you know what the worst part of that day was for me? It wasn't the embarrassment. It wasn't even the things you said. It was the 5 seconds where I looked into my daughter's eyes, and a complete stranger was looking back at me. That's a hard thing to forget. A fresh wave of tears fell down Chloe's face, and this time she didn't try to stop them. She understood. He was telling her that the wound was deeper than an apology could reach. She gave a small, defeated nod and began to turn away to leave him in peace. She had said what she needed to say. She couldn't ask for anything more. Wait, he said, his voice stopping her in her tracks. He turned to his workbench where a small, simple block of blonde maple sat, half-sanded. He picked it up, along with 2 squares of sandpaper, one rough, one fine. He held them out to her. Chloe looked at the block of wood in his hands, confused. Your hands look cold, he said simply. Sanding will warm them up. You start with the rough paper. Go with the grain, always with the grain. And you keep going until every single scratch is gone. Then you move to the fine paper. You do it until it's as smooth as glass. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an embrace. It was an invitation and a test. It was the first lesson in a language she had never learned. She stared at the wood, then at his outstretched, waiting hand. After a long moment she reached out and took the block and the sandpaper. Her fingers brushed his, and it was the first time they had touched in years. The wood felt solid and real in her grasp. She moved to the far end of the long workbench, a few feet away from him. Hesitantly, she wrapped the rough paper around the block and began to sand, her first movements clumsy and awkward. Alan turned back to his own project, the silence of the workshop broken now by a new, shared sound. It was the quiet, rhythmic rasp of sandpaper on wood. The sound of 2 broken people, side by side in the dust and the light, beginning the slow, patient, and difficult work of making something smooth again.